All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for attending our panel. I'll introduce you very briefly to your panelists. We hope by the end of this session to have enlightened you as to current events in terms of what's happening in Syria vis-a-vis the opposition and the opposition's efforts to bring down the regime. And the process that we're going to follow will be that each of your panelists will speak for approximately 15 minutes. We're going to try and keep it nice and tight and then give you the rest of the time to engage us in questions or issues that you'd like us to maybe expand on or develop for you. I think this would make it, we'd like to keep this reasonably informal. And I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Amr Al-Azam. I'm a professor at Shawnee State University in Ohio, and I'm also a member of the Syrian opposition and an activist. I'm fairly new to the Syrian opposition activism side of things, but then so is the whole Arab Spring thing. It's new to a lot of us. Next to me is Professor Najib Ghadban, and I'll let him introduce himself when his turn comes to speak. And then next to him is Maria Stefan as well, and I'll let her introduce herself when it's her turn to speak. Right. For my 15 minutes worth of talk to you, I'm going to try and cover some of the following talking points. I want to introduce a little bit. I want to bring you to you an idea. Okay, this is really bad. I'm sorry. That's terrible.
Good reminder.
Yeah, switch off cell phones. I want to, as talking points, I want to introduce to you the opposition, a little bit about the makeup of the opposition, what is the Syrian opposition, and then I want to talk a little bit about possibly strategies that, in a very broad sense, general strategies in terms of how I see the opposition or the uprising against the regime perhaps panning out. And then, time given, I'd like to also cover briefly or try and give you some sense of how I perceive the regime to be responding to the crisis it is facing, which in my opinion and the opinion of many people is a terminal crisis for it. I'll start off by saying that I generally classify the opposition to three broad categories. We have what first we call the traditional opposition. And this is either known figures or groups that are usually intellectuals, what we often also refer to as the tea house opposition, from their habit of hanging out in the local tea houses of Damascus or Aleppo or wherever, and basically, talking about the regime and talking about what can be done, and so on and so forth. These include people like Arif Dalila, Riyad Saif, Maleh, and so on and so forth. They're Michel Kilo, and so on and so forth. Then you have another traditional group, what you might call the traditional opposition, and these would be more party-based, and these would include people like the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, or groups such as the Ittihad Ishtiraki. These would be, usually Nasrite, pan-Arab, leftist ideologies, leftovers, if you want, from the 60s and 70s. But they exist out there as well. So this is your traditional opposition, or an example of your traditional opposition. Your second group would be the youth movements, if you want, the street. What you see today on your TV screens, young people out on the street protesting, your activists. They tend to be young, and it's important to know that until very, very recently did not really identify with the first category that I mentioned to you, the traditional opposition. In fact, until very recently there was very little name recognition amongst those street activists as to your traditional groups. The third category that I would introduce you to is the external opposition, the diaspora, which has in many ways grown tremendously. Initially, the diaspora included, was fairly restricted to the exiles who had been, forced to leave Syria over the years for a variety of misdemeanors, be they Muslim Brotherhood who were banned from Syria after the early 1980s, to more politically active individuals. But now the external opposition is much broader. It includes people from all walks of life. It includes people like myself, and so on and so forth. The external opposition started to bring itself together and coalesce following the events of mid-March through a series of meetings and conferences. And it started off, I suppose the first major big gathering was the one held in Antalya, quickly followed by Brussels, and you had then several others in Istanbul, and ultimately culminating in what is known as the Syrian National Council, the SNC, which I believe Najib will cover more adequately for you. Often it's been interpreted as a sign, or initially has been interpreted as a sign of division amongst the opposition. The opposition is divided. It's not, able to work together. There are too many, but really it's not. I always answer that by saying it's not. You should interpret this as a process of coalescing, a process of sitting out and debating and discussing those various issues and viewpoints, and this is an opportunity. Remember, the Syrian opposition, or Syrians in general, we've never really had that opportunity to do that, and we've never had an arena to present our ideas and our thoughts, and these conferences were a good example of where Antalya, for example, you had a gathering of many different groups and ideologies, for the first time able to sit in the same room and not get into physical fights even, and this set up and laid the ground for later events to happen, including our current Syrian National Council. In terms of strategies, I think it's important to understand the nature of the regime and its relationship with its society and the system as a whole, in order to begin to understand how you might be able to break it up a bit. Also, when I say regime, remember the regime is a very broad, extensive entity, and often when we talk about bringing down the regime, we're talking about bringing down a very small clique of people. Really, we're talking about a very narrow group of people represented by Bashar al-Assad, his brother, his, Asif Shaukat, and a few others around them, possibly not growing beyond, a list of 15 or 20 names by some counts. So when we say we want to drive a wedge or to break up or split the regime off from the rest of its people, we mean those guys. And I think this is important to bear in mind. The strategy is in particular going after what we refer to as the merchant military complex. That is that relationship that emerged in the 70s between the merchant classes of Damascus and Aleppo and the military officers, the military caste of the regime. And in beginning to, if we can drive a wedge between those, if we can separate the regime from the rest of its components, or let's say that small decision-making clique from the rest of its components, then I think we have a chance of bringing down this regime without any further, or without any severe bloodshed or going into a civil war scenario, which is very much a possibility right now. The if you look at the opposition, you need to see it in the following shape, I think. You have on the one side, it's a wedge. It's a three-sided wedge. On one side, you have the street protests. You have the street protesters who are going out almost every day now. It's very widespread. You see it in almost every city in Syria has at some point in the past or continuing to bring people out on the street. The bigger, the better. They're very important, and they have a most important purpose. They're not going to bring down the regime by themselves. The street protests will not bring down the regime, but what they do is they send a clear and unequivocal message to the regime: you are not in control. And a regime like that is all about control. Okay, the regime, if Bashar al-Assad is not able to say to the people around him, I am in charge, I'm in control, then that is a serious issue. So a challenge to the authority of the regime is absolutely deadly to it, in the sense that if the regime is unable to persuade or demonstrate that it is in charge, then it is in serious trouble. And that is what the street protests do. They continuously challenge the authority of the regime and challenge the ability of the regime to say, I'm in charge. And ultimately, this failure by the regime to keep these protests under control is what has brought the Arab states to its current situation of, in effect, reviewing the viability of Bashar al-Assad's regime as being in charge of the Syrian state. Because they're turning around and saying, if you're in charge, then act like you're in charge, and if you're not in charge, you better step aside, because this cannot go on the way it is. The second side of the wedge is that merchant military complex. It's the economy. Okay, and the relationship between the merchants and the system, in terms of the system is there to help the merchants make money. If the merchants are losing money, if the economy is tanking, if the merchant classes are no longer able to do business the way they are, then their support for the regime is going to start to initially shrink, maybe withdraw into a sullen silence, and eventually it's going to rise to clamor by saying, look, you really are making a mess of things. We accept what we have with you in return for the fact that we're able to conduct our business. But if your existence as a regime is seriously hampering our ability to conduct our business, and we're not just talking about the shopkeepers with the little stores, we're also talking about the big national big businesses and people with major need to access markets and institutions beyond the confines of Damascus and Aleppo, perhaps. Now, that's two sides of the wedge. And the third side of the wedge, if you want, the top of the wedge, is going to be the international community and the pressure the international community is going to be able to bear. And that's going to be the hammer that punches down this wedge and forces it to split up, separate the small decision-making clique of the regime away from the rest of it. If we can do that, and if we can bring enough pressure to bear down there, then you will get that separation. And once that separation happens, the regime will find it increasingly harder to sort of hold itself together, and it is then more likely for the regime to sort of keel over. So it's like a three-legged stool, in effect, and you take those legs away, and it will just sort of drop. In terms of outlook for the regime, I think that it's important to recognize that the regime is not about to collapse any second today or tomorrow. I think we still have some way to go. I think anybody who tells you that collapse is imminent is being a little too optimistic. But if you ask me to give you an honest opinion of where the regime is today, I think it is in a terminal state. The question is not if it falls, but when and how. Will it fall with a catastrophic implosion and leaving behind it a major power vacuum, or will it degrade slowly to a point of no return with a opposition ready to fill in the void and take over? And that is one of the things that the opposition is supposedly going to be, or is working towards ensuring that there is no void there that is left, to be exploited or to create a major problem. The regime at the same time is obviously working and capitalizing on the idea that if a void happens, if there is a power vacuum, then there's going to be serious blowback for the region as a whole, and it is holding that over the heads of its neighbors and so on and so forth. I think I'm right on the mark here, right on the button. So I'm going to pass the mic on to my colleague Najib to take over for the next part of our panel.
Thank you, Amr, for organizing this. Hello. And I'll try to, in my 14 minutes, focus on maybe different points, but that would complement what Amr presented. My first point is that I think it is important to situate the Syrian revolution in the Arab Spring. And the second point, this revolution was in fact the culmination of work that began long time ago. I would say maybe with the next day of the rise of Bashar al-Assad to power. With that, maybe I could, quickly remind you of the movement, which was kind of nicknamed the Damascus Spring in 2000, following Bashar's ascendance to the presidency, in which there was this spontaneous movement of intellectuals, activists, demanding basic reforms. There was a famous statement signed by intellectuals, including well-known intellectuals like Amr's dad and others, basically demanding, releasing political prisoners, asking for lifting of emergency laws in effect since 1963, allowing exiles to go back. These were the first demands, and I think it is significant to highlight those efforts because now when the opposition is asked, do you believe in dialogue with this regime? What's your vision of reform? It is, I think significant to say that that's been our demands all along for the last 11 years. Then we have the statement of the 1,000, which followed that one. This one, I think what added to the previous demands is a new element. It emphasized that, in fact, you cannot have economic reform, which what the regime tried to present as a priority, without having some political reform that would entail rule of law, respect for the judiciary, and so on and so forth. We know how the Damascus Spring ended, but that movement was never really repressed totally. So we see a revival of that movement in 2003. And this is again was coincided with the efforts of the Bush administration to bring a lot of things to the region, including democracy. And I think the message from the opposition at the time was, if you are serious about facing external pressure and challenges, you have to fix your domestic house. And that again requires some basic reforms, economic, administrative, political, and so on and so forth. We come to 2005, it's actually October 2005. There was something called the Damascus Declaration. It's an important document that became the consensus of the opposition at the time, and it's clearly embraced the notion of comprehensive democratic change in Syria. Again, it was connected to another event in the region, and that is the post-assassination of former Prime Minister Rafiq al-Hariri, in which there were some indication that the members of the Syrian regime had something to do with it. So the process continues. All the way, there was another effort by the external opposition to form the Syrian Salvation Front, this time made up of former Vice President Khaddam, members of the Brotherhood, Kurdish factions, as well as independents and intellectuals. So we get to 2010. 2010, 2009, 2010 were not good years for the Syrian opposition. These 2 years, there was an attempt by the international community to rehabilitate the Syrian regime into the regional international politics after 4 years of isolation. But it wasn't really a good year for any country. I attended a conference in October 2010 in Morocco about democracy and human rights in the Arab world. And we were sharing our experiences in all Arab countries, and so the overall assessment was very dismal. I mean, even Morocco, which hosted us and was witnessing regression back then. But who knew a vendor, in fact, would set the whole region on fire in the beginning of this year. Again, I do give this background to say that what you see today is a culmination of those efforts and the fact that there always has been opposition, there always has been political activism inside Syria that's never accepted the notion of the one-party state, the one-family rule, the sectarian nature of that regime, and so on and so forth. Now, with the beginning of the Arab Spring, I think, again, I mentioned this to my colleagues, I was involved in a debate. When would it happen in Syria? This is January 2011. And it was difficult to predict. But I think one of the factors that's really speeded up the process and led to the demonstrations was the reaction of the regime, of Bashar himself. End of January 2011, he gave an interview to the Wall Street Journal. It's, I think, is a very significant interview, long interview, and in which he said that those Arab regimes which did not initiate reform by then are in trouble. I think he was right. But he said that would not apply to him because he already, had done a lot. But then when he was pressed to present his vision of the reform, he talked about 3 areas. And one of them, he said he was willing to liberalize media law in Syria, which would, allow maybe independent magazine here and journal there to exist. He talked about maybe licensing more NGOs in Syria and introducing some measures to improve the transparency of the local election. Those were the 3 areas of reforms that he was willing to offer. It was shocking to the Syrian youth who were watching hours and hours of coverage of the Tunisian and Egyptian, and so really Syria needed a spark, and the spark came from the city of Daraa in the south, when the story of a few school children wrote on the wall, "It's time for you, Mr. Bashar." They used the phrase, which became one of the nicest slogan, "Shab yurid isqat al-nizam," that people want to overthrow the regime. And they were arrested with their families, teachers, tortured, their nails were pulled, and it was awful. And then when their families went to ask about their fate, they were told an awful response from the head of the security apparatus in that city, who happened to be the cousin of Bashar. Now, had the regime responded in addressing maybe the grievances of the people of Daraa, maybe he could have averted a real revolution. And I think the main mistake that the regime made was to open fire and kill demonstrators, peaceful demonstrators. I think at that point, it was a turning point for the Syrian revolution. And I think at that point, I think what my colleague Amr said, a lot of Syrians were shocked, inside and outside, and they decided this regime lost whatever claim it had to legitimacy by then. The road, my second point, and I'm going to be very brief here and just say a few words about the outlook. The road to the formation of an umbrella organization called the Syrian National Council, and since I'm involved in this, in fact, Amr was involved as well. It took a while to do this. We went through the phase of holding conferences abroad. And it was necessary for Syrians to get to know each other, for them to try to articulate a message. And then we went through the phase of trying to connect between the outside and the inside. And finally, I think we came up with this formula, which is still, I would say, with all modesty, a work in progress of an umbrella organization which tries to speak for the Syrian revolution and embrace its goals and to keep it true to its 2 or 3 basic objectives. The first of which, this revolution is peaceful. This is how the most famous slogan in Syria, it's Silmiya, Silmiya. The second one, to make sure and to emphasize national unity. This is not a one sect revolution or one political group revolution. It's all Syrians, and in order, in fact, to counter the effort of the regime to push towards some kind of a sectarian strife in the country. The third principle, the notion of maintaining and keeping the integrity, territorial integrity of Syria. And early on, I think you see more emphasis on one phrase, that is, there is no to foreign intervention, military intervention. I think lately, as the regime continued its repression of peaceful dissent, you see more demands coming from these youth calling for the protection of civilians. And if that meant foreign intervention, so let it be. I think the Syrian National Council embraces these goals, try to, again, create a balance between the inside and the outside, to create another balance between the various political groups. I think it was received and supported by the youth of Syria the first Friday after it was announced. It was welcomed by many countries around the world. Got one recognition from Libya, Free Libya. That's very welcome. We hope other revolutionary countries like Tunisia and Egypt would follow suit, and of course other countries in the world. Now, the last point, I'll be very quick. I like to keep more room for maybe discussion and questions. The outlook, how does this SNC in fact see the future, and both in terms of bringing down this regime and the post-Assad alternative? Well, it seems that the regime has been really trying very hard to push the situation in Syria into some kind of a sectarian strife and conflict and war. We see this with, again, the fact that the repressive, maybe elite unit that's carrying most of the killing happened to be recruited from one particular background. It was interesting that the regime is using this claim of that it's battling armed gangs. Again, they haven't really been able to prove any of that. I think lately we've seen more defection at the low level of the army, and it's those young people who are defecting have been in fact shot on the right there, or they've been embattling other elites units of the regime, of the military, of the mukhabarat, and that's what we see more. Maybe movement toward the militarization of the Syrian revolution. Now, the second maybe possibility is the military intervention, foreign military intervention. And as I said, that's not something Syrian activists would like. They don't really embrace that. However, I think more of them have been entertaining the notion that the call for some kind of a civilian protection is needed from the international community, and that's the only way maybe that can place some pressure on the regime of Bashar al-Assad. I think in this context I might say a few words about the Arab Initiative, which was introduced 2 or 3 days ago. The Arab Initiative kind of has 2 elements. One, kind of calling on the regime to end the killing, repression, violence. Well, it says on all parties, but we're obviously talking here mostly about the regime. And secondly, it calls for a dialogue between the regime and the opposition. That kind of, a lot of people ask where does the Syrian National Council stands on that and other opposition groups. It's very simply, we feel that we welcome any efforts to end the killing in Syria, which is a daily occurrence. This morning, I think, as of now, we have 18 killed today because they are demonstrating. These are civilian killing, killed by the security forces. So that's a priority. So any initiative that leads to the end of killing is welcome. However, that should entail as well, granting the rights of people to protest peacefully, which is guaranteed by even the current Syrian constitution. And as far as the dialogue, as far as we're concerned, any such dialogue should lead to democratic transition in Syria. Otherwise, it's a meaningless. We do consider, again, Syrian revolution is a continuation of the Arab Spring, and like Tunisia, like Egypt, like Libya, the Syrians deserve freedom and dignity and nothing less. I'm going to stop here and pass this on to my colleague here. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Najib, and thanks to Amr for organizing this panel. My name is Maria Stefan, and I work at the U.S. State Department on Syria and Arab Spring issues, but I need to really emphasize that I was invited to participate on this panel discussion based on my scholarly capacity. I'm not representing the U.S. government in the USG perspective or position on Syria or the Middle East. I was invited because I happen to be a scholar of civil resistance and strategic nonviolent movements, and recently published a book with Erica Chenoweth called Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict, and edited a book last year called Civilian Jihad, Nonviolent Struggle, Democratization, and Governance in the Middle East. So I was asked to talk about whether civil resistance has a shot in a place like Syria, where the regime has demonstrated its willingness to use brutal violence against nonviolent, unarmed protesters, has been willing to kill children, torture people, detain thousands. Is there a nonviolent resistance possibility today in Syria? And I would start off by, and beyond that, if yes, what could the opposition be doing short of taking up arms in order to achieve a transition inside the country? And so I would start by saying that I fully acknowledge that Syria is a very difficult environment for civil resistance, both because of the regime's brutality, because of the sectarian nature of the conflict, the regional aspects, but at the same time, I don't believe at this point that a descent to sectarian warfare, civil war is inevitable, and I don't believe that an armed struggle is necessary or would be the best option to remove the Assad regime and to promote a democratic transition in the country. My main point would be that the skills and strategic savvy of the opposition matter as much, if not more, than anything that the Assad regime does in determining the outcome of this struggle. And so first, some empirical evidence to back up this claim. Historically, civil resistance, which is a method of waging struggle that does not entail the use or threat of violence, involves tactics ranging from protests to boycotts, strikes, civil disobedience, sit-ins, creation of parallel structures and institutions. Gene Sharp identified almost 200 methods of nonviolent action that movements have used around the world. So civil resistance campaigns have had a surprisingly good track record historically. My co-author, Erica Chenoweth, and I looked at 323 violent and nonviolent campaigns from 1900 to 2006. And we found that nonviolent campaigns succeeded nearly twice as often as armed struggles in campaigns targeting regimes against foreign occupations and for self-determination. They succeeded 53% of the time compared to 27% of the time for armed campaigns. We also found that key structural factors, including regime type, ethno-sectarian divisions in the society, GDP. These type of factors were not determinative in terms of the outcomes of these campaigns. We also found, importantly, that transitions driven by nonviolent resistance tend to create more durable and internally peaceful democracies than transitions provoked by violent insurgencies, which are far more likely to fall back into civil war and strife. So this is particularly important if you care about what happens after the regime change. The methods used are very important in determining the outcome. So why do nonviolent campaigns tend to have a strategic advantage? Our argument in the book is that a higher and more diverse level of participation allows for obviously more people to participate from different segments of society, allowing for greater leverage and pressure against the regime or other opponent. And the key underlying secret of civil resistance is that no dictator, no matter how brutal, is ever as powerful as he or she, although it's often more he, seems. All dictators rely on other people, their resources, their skill sets, including men with guns, in order to maintain power. And when large numbers of people stop obeying, stop cooperating, the regime finds it very difficult, if not impossible, to maintain power and control over society. So I wanted to read first a short quote by Gene Sharp, again, sort of the godfather in the field of strategic nonviolent action. He wrote, "By themselves, rulers cannot collect taxes, enforce repressive laws and regulations, keep trains running on time, prepare national budgets, direct traffic, manage ports, print money, repair roads, keep food supplied to the markets, make steel, build rockets, train the police and army, issue postage stamps, or even milk a cow. People provide these services to the ruler, though through a variety of organizations and institutions. If the people stop providing these skills, the ruler cannot rule." Violent campaigns, on the other hand, tend to attract less participation in the society and must therefore rely far more heavily on external foreign support, which is often the case in many insurgency campaigns, with Libya being the most recent example. So turning the attention to Syria, my colleagues have already highlighted a number of trends that we're seeing and obvious challenges faced by the opposition inside the country. Yet, as Amr mentioned, anti-regime protests are continuing in cities, towns, villages throughout the country. But the sense is that the opposition is growing tired and exhausted. The regime has become relentless and efficient in targeting local leaders of these movements, which means that many of the strongest advocates of a nonviolent revolution are being removed from the battlefield. And this seeds the ground to those who are either calling for armed intervention from the outside, from foreign powers, or armed struggle in the way of an insurgency. So that's the first big trend. We're seeing, as Najib mentioned, intensifying opposition demands for external intervention, mainly to protect civilians, with calls for a no-fly zone growing louder. We have a Free Syrian Army defector units that are claiming that if they had more and better weapons, they would be able to topple the regime easily, which many analysts find difficult to believe. And the regime, the Assad regime, is using troop deaths caused by armed attacks, whether they're defectors or other armed groups, to reinforce its own narrative that it is fighting against terrorists and foreign-backed extremists. It's also using pro-regime rallies involving thousands of people, which are being covered extensively by state TV, as a powerful tool of its own propaganda. In addition to protests, we're seeing general strikes in places like Daraa, Homs, and Hama. Shop owners have been enduring threats from the regime and property damage, but the opposition has declared that these strikes have been successful, at least initially. Other tactics that have been used: lawyer sit-ins, symbolic actions like putting red food color into into fountains to signify the blood that's being shed. They're setting up sort of opposition songs that are being broadcast and played in undisclosed locations so that when security forces walk back and forth, these songs are blaring and they look awfully confused. And so they're coming up with very interesting, innovative tactics. Yet right now, the opposition remains dominated by Sunni participation, which makes sense because Sunnis constitute the vast majority of the population. And even though Kurds and the Druze minorities are stepping up their involvement in opposition activities, the opposition has been unable until now to convince currently passive but critical pillars of support that their interests will be better served following a transition than with the current regime. These include minorities, Christians, Alawi, workers, which is a critical pillar of support in many successful anti-dictatorship nonviolent movements, the business community, public servants, Baathists, notably those who are less motivated by ideology and more by material interests. As Amr mentioned, we are seeing signs that the regime is feeling the effect of economic sanctions. Business elites, merchants, traders are starting to complain more privately about the regime's erratic economic practices and behaviors. Yet, till now, and although businessmen have been supporting financially the opposition in certain ways, this private business class dissatisfaction with the regime has not translated into overt business community support for the opposition, which would be very important and send a strong signal to the Assad regime. As Najib mentioned, the SNC is working hard to come up with its own unity and a credible and inclusive transition plan that has internal buy-in, but until now has not gotten to that point. And many opposition activists inside Syria are very frustrated that there is no such plan or guidance forthcoming from the Council. So I would offer a few lessons from some previous nonviolent struggles, including the campaigns that are featured in the edited book, Civilian Jihad. Successful nonviolent campaigns generally feature three important ingredients, and those are unity, planning, and nonviolent discipline. So unity entails uniting various disparate groups within an opposition movement inside and outside the country, broadening and widening the resistance to include groups that are critical to the regime's grip on power. And I mentioned a few of these: minorities, workers, Baathist business communities, others. My former colleague at the NGO where I used to work, the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, once used the term when discussing unity that a movement needs a galvanizing proposition, a message to send to different groups in society, including erstwhile regime supporters and fence-sitters, to be able to convince them to actively join an opposition movement. And these messages will vary based on the different groups in society, based on their interests, grievances, and aspirations. Planning. Strategic planning is as critical to nonviolent movements as it is to armed struggles. Planning starts with an analysis of the regime, if that is the opponent's sources of power, be they economic, political, social, military, its main pillars of support, so those organizations and institutions in society that allow it to control and withhold power and control a society, and determining how and with which groups in society you can sever the regime's access to those sources of power and pillars of support. And recognizing that within any particular pillar, the individuals in that pillar are not equally loyal to a regime. There's no such thing as a homogenous government, business community, religious institutions. All of these pillars of support contain individuals that are less loyal to the regime. And it's the work of the opposition to identify who these individuals are and how to win them over to the opposition. It's important to point out, after the analysis and the development of a strategy, that then comes tactical choices. You can't decide upon which nonviolent tactics are appropriate whether to use strikes, boycotts, sit-ins, until you have a strategic plan. And obviously, that comes after you've united the opposition. The third key ingredient is nonviolent discipline. This is not morally important, it's strategically critical. Nonviolent discipline is what allows civil resistance to have a comparative advantage over armed struggles in that it maximizes participation in the movement. The more violent an opposition becomes, the less people are going to participate in it, generally speaking. And also, it allows, when you use violence against soldiers in the regime, you offer the opponent justification for its own violent crackdown. When it becomes clear that the regime is using violence against unarmed protesters committed to nonviolent resistance, the use of violence against those protesters is much more likely to backfire and alienate the regime. And you're more likely to see defections when the resistance is nonviolent than when it is armed. So the other points that flow from that, and I'll just end with a few observations from successful and failed nonviolent campaigns. The first would be that the quality and diversity of participation in civil resistance is often more important than the quantity. Winning over critical pillars of support, including those groups that the regime currently relies upon for its own power base, is more important than bringing the same individuals from one particular group out for street protests and demonstrations. So identifying who those critical groups are and getting them involved, whether they're the business community, the bureaucrats, diplomats abroad, bringing them into the struggle is very, very important. Tactical diversification helps keep the opponent off guard. One of the main mistakes that many unsuccessful nonviolent movements make is that they rely on one or two main tactics, protests and strikes, rather than considering the whole panoply of hundreds, literally hundreds, of different nonviolent tactics, ranging from more symbolic to more aggressive, that are available to civil resistors. Although strikes have historically been incredibly powerful against dictatorships in that they have paralyzed economies, they're not the only tactic, and a movement must be able to consider various approaches and tactics that have been used in different parts of the world when they're developing a strategic plan. Tactical innovation and movement momentum go hand in hand. People grow frustrated and fatigued, particularly if you are a protester facing a barrage of regime fire, tank fire, snipers every day. You grow tired, fatigued doing street protests and demonstrations. There has to be something else for people to do to protest, or they'll stop protesting and again cede the ground to a violent alternative. And I would end on the notion of dilemma actions, the importance of dilemma actions in civil resistance campaigns. These are actions that basically put the regime or the opponent between a rock and a hard place, so that no matter how the regime responds, it's going to lose face and lose power. So as an example, I used to associate with some of the Serbian members of the Otpor movement that helped nonviolently oust Milosevic in 2000. And they developed a tactic that involved putting a barrel in the middle of a street in Belgrade. And they put a sign with Milosevic's picture on the barrel with a slot where people could put coins and money in the barrel. And they said, please contribute funding, some coins, to support Milosevic's retirement. If you don't have any money because the economy under Milosevic is so terrible, here is a bat, please hit the barrel. So because so many young people and other people in society were out of work, had no money, or they wanted to prove the point, they went up and started hitting the barrel, hundreds if not thousands of people. Eventually, the Serbian police showed up, was very upset. Where is this barrel coming from? What's it doing here? What are these people doing? That they picked up the barrel and put it into the police car and brought it back to the station after beating up, of course, some of the people around the barrel. So the Serbian opposition caught on camera the police arresting a barrel, which, of course, looks pretty bad for the regime. Now, I'm not suggesting that this tactic could work in Serbia or in Syria, but I know that the Syrians understand the role of humor, and I think that they're creative and entrepreneurial enough to come up with these type of tactics that could be incredibly powerful. So with that, I'll guess open it up to Q&A.
What's been the role of Iran in supporting the regime, and what would be the limits of what Iran could do to support the regime?
Now, we know that the Iranians have been providing the regime with an array of different types of support, a lot of it logistic, some of it technical, and I also believe a not unsubstantial amount of advice on how to handle an uprising, since they had one of their own a few years before. I think it was in 2009. And it's interesting to note that the regime did not pay any attention to what the Iranians were telling them. In fact, it was very clear, because you could see from from quite early on the way the regime was responding to the uprising, with the very public and overt use of violence and use of live ammunition and so on and so forth. It's clear that they weren't listening. But it seems that this over time sort of changed a little bit. Not that they started to listen more, but that the situation escalated far beyond what the Iranian situation was like. So the advice, events overtook the advice itself. The other area that obviously the Iranians, I think, or let's say the Syrian regime is expecting the Iranians to help them out in, is perhaps in issues of funding money and ensuring, the flow of oil, and also very important for them, the situation in Iraq, and ensuring that the Maliki government in Iraq does not allow its territory to sort of become a safe haven for, anti-government protesters, or even armed. If an armed conflict, if it does degenerate into some sort of armed conflict, that the porous borders between Iraq and Syria do not sort of become a reverse situation for the Syrian regime. And it seems that so far this is working, because the Maliki government has not been supportive of the Syrian uprising. And recently, I don't know if you heard about it, there was some very high-tech, I believe, equipment, software that is used to monitor the internet, and this was supposedly bought by, or the contract was supposed to go to the Iraqi government from a company here in San Francisco, and it then suddenly mysteriously turned up in Syria. And again, and I think this is where the Iranians are primarily, in that sort of stuff, and just to make sure that the Iraqis stay on track on that one, and not very good for us right now.
There are about 1 million or 1.5 million Iraqis in Syria. Most of them are Sunni. What is their fate or role in these in this turmoil?
To my knowledge, many of them have decided to return to Iraq. And I think there's no evidence that they're taking side one way or the other in the conflict. Maybe they might be, I think, sympathetic to the Syrian revolution, but of course they can't really do much. But the one trend I could clearly see is that many of them felt Syria is no longer safe. So they're going back. Unfortunately, some of them are facing troubles going back to their homes. And the other point that's been reported lately, even trades between Iraq and Syria is declining and being affected by the revolution. So those are some of the quick effects of that on Iraqis. If you want to add anything. Oh, since I'm not, yes.
I wonder whether the rebels, as they called in Syria, the dissidents, are they engaged in any discussions with NATO to welcome them as the Libyan welcomed NATO? Also, if you can shed some light, who are these rebels? Are we talking about homogeneous sort of community, or are we talking about different sectors of the Syrian populations? Is there homogeneity there, or pluralism of ideas? And if Assad will be ousted, what would be the relationship with Israel?
There's no discussion between NATO and there's no discussion between NATO and Free Syria Army on any type of military strategy or cooperation. So I'll leave it at that.
But I would comment on the term rebels. I think what we see in Syria mostly is a peaceful protest movement, and that's really the essence of the Syrian revolution. They are youth. They cover most of the cities and towns of Syria. At typical Friday protests, you have demonstrations in between 120 to 200 sites throughout Syria. There have been, in fact, indications that maybe there is weakness in two areas, Aleppo and center of Damascus. Now, Damascus, I would say, has been very active. The suburb of Damascus, Damascus, two provinces or two areas. The suburbs has been actually very active in the Syrian protest. But the center maybe has not been as much due to the heavy presence of security forces. I think the Aleppo might be what Amr talked about, the merchant military industrial complex, I like that phrase, might be relevant because a lot of people in Aleppo have benefited from the economic activities lately with the officers related to Bashar al-Assad, and especially industrialists in Aleppo have not been very supportive of the revolution. However, I think today we've seen a major demonstration in Aleppo, but I think, again, it's a matter of time before we see that people in that city taking part and with the rest of the country.
Just to respond to the last part of your question, I think, quite frankly, the Syrian uprising is concerned with bringing down a dictatorial regime. Once you have a democratic, freely elected government that represents the will of the people, then outstanding issues with the State of Israel will be addressed by that, and any outcome from such a engagement is surely to be, more appropriate than having a dictator make a deal that is not represented by his people.
They don't speak about this now.
No, it is not an issue. It's a non-issue. It's not about foreign relations. It's about internal issues.
We're going to go to this side of the. Thank you.
Before I ask the question, just to answer this, just in a slight way, Barham Ghalioun in an interview with Al Akhbar mentioned three things. One of those things, he said, we are going to support the resistance. So I would like to stress on that or emphasize on that as you answer his question. My question is, Amr, I share most of your views, really. But let me place the devil's advocate here. How about if the Alawi withdraw and they want to have an Alawi state? And they have some support of the Christians, and we know, and I know myself from here, that Hezbollah is taking certain action on the grounds in Lebanon, in the north, probably toward that eventuality in the next 1 or 2 years. So what's your answer to that?
I can give you my take, and then I'll let Najib come to the rescue and pick up the pieces. Look, if we're, territorial integrity is not really at issue. Okay, first we bring down the regime. All right. Then, if there are groups within the state who have a particular view or vision, then that can be sort of brought forward. It's the Alawis. Let alone that. I mean, we have the Kurds. Okay, and you could even ask a more important question: what if the Kurds want to break away? I think that is a more likely issue than if the Alawis want to set up a sectarianly purified Alawi state. And if the Kurds, with their very strong traditional historic rights, have not demanded for that, in fact have gone for the opposite and said no, all the Kurdish groups that we are in contact with are basically calling are insisting on maintaining territorial integrity and are specifically, talking about themselves as being Syrian Kurds and not Kurdish guests living in Syria. So I think this is quite important. But if there are issues that can then be addressed relating to the rights of minorities and so on and so forth, then I think it's up to the opposition and whatever vision or future it has to address any fears or concerns that a given minority, whether it's sectarian or ethnic, has, and ensure that they stay part of that makeup. Otherwise, where do you stop? Today it's the Alawis. Tomorrow, it's everybody who wants to dye their hair pink. Come on, gets a state. Where does it end? You can't just, if you have a state that is democratic with a constitution that respects the rights of minorities, where the will of the majority does not turn to the tyranny of the minority, and that is what that is what these guys are concerned about. And remember, finally, this is the regime scare mantra. If you let these guys take over, you're going to become, and therefore you think about your future. Let's break away. And that is not, something that is that is not a part of the dialogue that is acceptable to us. We would want to do the opposite and ensure that we can convince these people otherwise.
Again, I second what Amr says in terms of I don't think there is a strong demand among the Alawites or other minorities to have their own states or many states. I think that's not something right there. But what's out there is definitely the regime is using scare tactics within these minorities. And it was interesting that the first person to mention the word civil war was Buthaina Shaban, the president's advisor, in her first press conference. It was not mentioned by any of the protesters, any of the opposition, any of the activists. To the contrary, the word from day one of the activists was emphasizing again, we're one, we're Syrians, and national unity. The question of Burhan Ghaliun making a statement.
Gave an interview, and when he was asked about the three things that the Syrian National Council stand for, the third thing he mentioned, he said, this National Council is going to always support the resistance. It's right there in Al-Akhbar.
Resistance to who?
What resistance?
Resistance.
Sure, resistance. You specifically, be specific.
No, resistance against Israel.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
I think, let me be...
And those who support resistance against Israel.
Okay. I believe 2 points I want to make here. First, I do believe that, generally speaking, Syrians are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. I mean, there's no doubt about that, in the sense that they would believe that there should be a Palestinian state coexisting side by side with the state of Israel. However, I think a lot of Syrians are sick, and of course, are sick of this whole exploitation of the regime of the so-called Palestinian card and of the resistance in order to keep the security apparatus. So I think people are going to emphasize their domestic agenda, they're to focus on development and on restoring their occupied territory, the Golan, through peaceful means. I think these are, I would say there's consensus over that. So if he meant that, I don't know, again, I don't want to speak on his behalf. I don't know what he meant, just a statement. And the second point, I do believe there is an opportunity now in the region, coinciding with the Arab Spring, to promote something else that the region needs, and then that is peace between Israel and its neighbors. So we'll take more questions. I think we have about 8 minutes, so yes, sir. If you want to comment on it.
Most commentators, and I think government officials in the West, seem to take the view that in this case, the devil we don't know must be better than the devil we know, which seems kind of persuasive to me, yet I keep running into some people who fear that the successor will be a Sunni Salafist regime. So how would you address that concern?
I I'm perplexed as to where the Sunni Salafist regime component. So far we have seen hardly any Sunni Salafis emerging within the opposition, and in fact even within the uprising they're not very well represented on the ground or within the opposition movement as leaders or otherwise. So
I'm not sure that's necessarily relevant.
Yeah.
They can take a strategic point of view to lay the beats. What about if you have Muslim Brotherhood, not Salafist?
Yeah, but okay, even the Muslim Brotherhood, I can tell you, and I know some of them. The dialogue right now that they have, the model for them, in many ways, is a Turkish one. Okay, the way Turkey is going, but irrespective of how they see it, at the end of the day, the point is this: the Syria that is to emerge from a post-Assad regime is going to be a Syria that is governed by a constitution, by democracy, by a parliamentary system, and an elected presidency. If we have issues with that, then okay, let's hear them. But I don't think beyond that. So whether you have a Muslim Brotherhood that goes into elections, wins an election, and then loses the next one, what difference does it make? And to assume otherwise, to assume that. Yeah, no, I know what you're thinking. I know what you're thinking.
You can't tell me that question. You can't possibly answer that question.
No. I'm just saying. Look, if the Muslim Brotherhood.
What could possibly happen?
Hey, can I give the answer? You're. I think at the end of the day, if you have a state, if you are able to create a state based and founded on these principles, then political parties, whether they are right-wing, left-wing, religious, non-religious, all compete in the same arena. And if you have a state with the necessary structures that are able to, maintain this system, then that is what we're working for. To ask me to project what if they take over, or what if you have the. I don't think that is, what I know what I'm working for, and I know what I would like to fight against. When there is a Salafi attempt to take over, you will see me down on the street fighting with the same veracity, and you will see Najib and you will see others fighting against that in the same way that they fought against Assad. We're not going to replace one tyranny with another tyranny. That is not the case, and that is not what is acceptable. And that is one of the critical points of not just what's happening in Syria, but of the Arab Spring, Arab uprising, whatever you want to call it. Okay, so I think that's important for us. Najib, if you want to add.
Say one more. I mean, why do you think all Syrians are devils? You know and you don't know. They are humans and normal, and there are angels among them. Yeah, I know. But no, the point is very simple. I think Syrians, if there's one thing that unites them, is they don't want any form of dictatorship. I mean, that's something, they reach that conclusion. I think everybody signed into the civil democratic state, including the Islamists of Syria, who are actually a small group within the Syrian political map, I would say. And particularly, I mean, the Islamists, and Amr, I think, tried to answer that. I think we have to follow the changes that we see within Islamists and throughout the Arab world. Take, for instance, the Islamists of Tunisia, who won the election. I think as long as they are committed to the civil democratic state and to the secular nature of that state and to the protection of women's rights and minority rights, I think they are going to be more like the Turkish model. So I don't think we're moving into a more extremist model in the Arab world. And maybe I would bring one point Maria said about the way the transition happens. I think if we are going through more peaceful transition, we're likely to have better prospect of having a more democratically functional government. But if we move maybe through violent transition, that could open the prospect. And I'm not naive here, to say that you could have maybe some extremist element. But I think at least all of the groups that sign into the Syrian National Council, for instance, among others, and the youth who are demonstrating in the street, none of them are demanding any Salafi or Islamic state. They want clearly a civil democratic state.
What could be worse than the Assad regime yet?
I think we could take two last questions, so the gentleman in the back and the gentleman here.
The gentleman with the military haircut.
Okay.
Good afternoon. My name is Joe Skelly. I have a question for Dr. Stefan. We've seen two, general models of government or regime resistance to popular movements based on a peaceful strategy that you eloquently outlined. Well, we've seen a few, but roughly speaking, in Egypt, we had a period of civil resistance and demonstrations. The regime cracked down initially and then gave way, and the Arab Spring gained momentum. But 2009 in Iran, we had a popular movement, demonstrations, and the regime cracked down, continued to crack down, and ended the demonstrations and restored power. So, with your analysis, which one do you foresee playing out in Syria? That's my first question. And my second question is, does the Iranian experience highlight some sort of, I wouldn't be so use such a strong word as limits, but some areas of your analysis that you could expand on?
Should we take the last question? Sure. Let's take the last question and then right here.
Professor Radban, you portrayed the current upheavals as the culmination of the Damascus Spring, which is, I think, a really valid argument. Now, several German political scientists argued that the US intervention in Iraq and the subsequent chaos really disencouraged further upheavals or further demands for democratization. Of course, Condoleezza Rice currently tries to frame it differently, but what would be your point on that? Thank you.
Yep, okay. So on what do I think the outcome is going to be? Is it going to be Egypt or Iran? I mean, it's very hard for me to predict something like that. There are many intervening variables, and frankly, a lot depends on not only what the regime does, not only the international sanctions and pressure, but a lot depends on the choices that the opposition itself makes. And a lot depends on whether or not the opposition is able to broaden and expand the participation of various groups in society. It will be arguably decisive if you start to see Sunni businessmen and Christian and Alawi business people becoming actively involved in the opposition. If you start to see prolonged worker strikes in critical sectors, businesses, that sort of thing, if they start to become involved, and by the way, this was a big thing that helped the Egyptian revolution. There was a precursor to the Egyptian popular uprising that ousted Mubarak in 2005 called the Kafaya movement, which was the first movement of its kind to engage in street protests and demonstrations, brought together a broad ideological spectrum to join in the resistance. But what it was not able to do was articulate what it stood for. The Kafaya movement was very much a no movement and couldn't really articulate what it was for. And it did not reach out to ordinary people and workers. What shifted the tide against Mubarak and brought masses of people out was when, hundreds of thousands of workers began to not only protest, but engage in labor strikes. So to the extent that the opposition is able to unite around a strategy and bring in these different groups, the so-called critical pillars of support, I think it has a strong chance at succeeding. If it's able to prevent violent escalation, by making a strong case for the strategic problematic nature of engaging in armed resistance in this environment, and that's going to be difficult to do. It takes leadership, it takes organization, but if the leadership of the opposition is able to convince different groups not to take up arms offensively against the regime, that will also be a factor. There were certainly disunity in Iran was part of the problem, and in the recent uprising, even though I applaud the courage of the Iranians who went out in the streets and resisted nonviolently, they were highly reliant on a couple of charismatic leaders who, when they left the picture, were imprisoned, the movement sort of went away, and I think they haven't been, unlike the '79 revolution, haven't been able to reach out to all the critical groups and segments of society and bring them into the opposition.
Just a question about the Damascus Spring and the impact of the American invasion of Iraq. I think you're right that the post-US invasion of Iraq damaged the cause of democracy in the region, because it connected democracy with kind of, enforcing it from outside, and especially the chaotic implication of that, and like 2 years that followed that, which in fact played into the hands of the status quo and dictators like Assad and others in the region. But I think this Arab Spring is all about really domestic. It's a genuine domestic movement that's demanding freedom, dignity. These are the words. They're not about the U.S. They're not about Israel. And I think that's what makes them different this time. Yes, there are going to be, I think, implications internationally for those changes in those countries. But this is why I think the U.S., the Obama administration, didn't know how to respond first to the Tunisia, but then as they got to Egypt, I think they more kind of demanded that Mubarak must go. I think they did the right thing, and so this is maybe a time where we could reconcile between U.S. foreign policy in peacefully promoting democracy in the region and those movements. I think that's why I think people in Syria do appreciate any kind of international support comes from the international community. I don't know if I'm answering the question. The last comment to Amr, and then we'll end. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for attending. I'd like to just close by saying that it is interesting because we hear this repeatedly, and that is concerns over minority rights or regional stability that feed into, well, at least, Bashar is at least, provides this sort of role here. And I would answer that by saying, these are valid concerns for just about everybody, but they should never become in any way an excuse for justifying the existence of a regime like the Assad regime. And really, if you want to address this issue, then you should look at the track record. And if you examine the Assad regime's record, whether it's minority rights or stability, then it's not good. So I don't see how a regime like that could somehow be good for the Syrian people or for its neighbors, including Israel. Working to bring that regime down is what we intend to do, and hopefully we will succeed. Thank you very much for attending the